Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something called distributed cognition. Now that might sound a bit academic, but the core idea is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
It's that our thinking and learning aren't just confined to what's going on inside our heads. They're actually spread out, distributed across the people we interact with, the tools we use, and, the spaces we're in.
That's right. And for this deep dive, you shared a really interesting collection of research looking at how this idea, distributed cognition, is being understood and used, especially in education.
Mm-hmm.
What's really intriguing and maybe a little complex is that there isn't one single way everyone defines it. It's a term that's being used in quite a few different senses.
Exactly. So our task today is to kind of unpack these different ways of thinking about it. We want to get a clearer sense of what distributed cognition really means for how you learn, how you collaborate,
Right.
and ultimately how you make sense of the world around you, all based on the insights from these sources. Okay, let's dig in a bit. One of the first things that caught my eye in the material was this concern that the term distributed cognition might be becoming too widespread,
Mm-hmm.
almost to the point where it's losing its punch. It's being applied so broadly that it might end up not telling us much, kind of like what happened with terms like schema or situated cognition.
That's a really important observation.
Yeah.
The authors of one of these papers, they point out a pattern in educational research where a promising term takes off, but then gets used so loosely that it loses its specific meaning.
Yeah.
And when a term isn't precise, it becomes harder for it to really guide research or, to differentiate between different ideas. It risks becoming just a popular phrase that gets attached to work without actually shaping how that work is done or understood.
It's almost like if we just started calling everything communication, right?
Yeah.
Without specifying if it's a phone call, a text, or a face-to-face conversation. It becomes much harder to have meaningful discussions or build on what others have found. So to avoid this kind of, fuzzy thinking, the sources suggest we need to be more specific about what we mean when we talk about distributed cognition.
Right.
And one way they do this is by describing a range of interpretations. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, what's fascinating here is the idea that the different ways researchers are thinking about distributed cognition can be seen as falling along a kind of spectrum.
Okay.
On one end, you have the idea that thinking is fundamentally something that happens inside an individual's mind, but, and this is key, with the understanding that this individual thinking is definitely shaped by things outside of us.
Like our tools, people.
Yeah, our tools, the people around us, the environment itself. Yeah. Then, on the other end of this spectrum, you find the perspective that thinking is inherently social.
Inherently social.
Yes.
Yes.
It's not just influenced by our social world. It's actually something that exists between people and within the social and cultural structures they create. And it can't really be broken down into just individual psychological parts.
Okay, so it's not a simple either of it's all in your head versus it's all out there.
Not at all.
There's a whole gradient of ways to understand how thinking gets distributed. And the authors of this overview see the different research papers in their collection fitting somewhere along this line.
Precisely.
Let's look at some of these specific viewpoints. The first one they describe, they call the individual plus view. What does that involve?
Well, the individual plus perspective, as the name suggests, it starts with the notion that thinking is primarily an individual activity. However,
But there's a plus.
right, the plus is that this view acknowledges that tools, other people, and the environment play a really significant role in supporting and shaping that individual thinking. From this standpoint, working in groups is often seen as beneficial because it can help individual people learn and develop their understanding.
So the main focus is still on the individual learner, but we're recognizing that these external factors are important pieces of the puzzle.
Exactly.
What kind of questions do researchers typically ask when they're coming from this individual plus angle?
A key question here is, how does working with others or using different tools like computers or even just notes, how does that affect what a person learns and how they think?
Okay.
The main goal is often to understand how these external elements impact an individual's cognitive processes and their learning outcomes. So for you listening, this might mean that when you're learning something new, paying attention not just to your own internal processes, but also how the materials you're using or the people you're working with are shaping your understanding. That's key.
That makes sense. And the source connects this individual plus view to some of the research in the collection. For example, they talk about Derry et al.'s research on interdisciplinary teams. How does their work fit into this picture?
So Derry and her colleagues were interested in how group thinking leads to the creation of intellectual work within a team. They studied these interdisciplinary teams working on projects together.
Right.
What's interesting is that they essentially tried to apply ideas about how an individual processes information, think about input, storage, and output, like a computer, to how a group works together.
Okay.
However, the researchers found it difficult to identify unique interactive processes at the group level that were, well, more than just the sum of what each individual brought to the table.
Ah,
So even though they were studying a group, their way of looking at it was still very much focused on how individual-level cognitive ideas might show up in a group setting.
okay. So they were looking at the group as a thinking entity, but analyzing it using ideas about individual thinking.
Pretty much, yeah.
And what about King's work on peer tutoring? That was also mentioned in the context of individual plus.
Yes. King's model of peer tutoring, where students of similar ability work together, also fits nicely with this individual plus view. Her model emphasizes how cognitive and metacognitive processes, things like planning your learning, thinking about your own thinking, how those can be distributed between the two students and the learning materials they're using.
Oh, okay. Distributed between them.
But the ultimate goal, from this perspective, is individual learning. The idea is that this distributed interaction leaves a cognitive residue.
Cognitive residue.
Yeah, lasting knowledge and skills within each individual student. Think of it like studying with a friend for a test. You both contribute to understanding the material, but the aim is for each of you to individually know the stuff for the exam.
Ah, so the collaboration is a means to an end, the end being individual learning and understanding.
Exactly.
The source also mentions that King's work draws on Vygotskian ideas like internalization and appropriation. Can you explain how those fit in here?
Certainly. Vygotsky's theory emphasizes that learning often happens through social interaction, right? And that cognitive abilities are often first developed in a social setting and then taken in and made one's own by the individual.
Okay.
Think of internalization, like when you first learn to ride a bike with someone holding on.
Yeah.
Eventually you can do it yourself. That external support becomes internal skill.
Right.
Appropriation is similar. It's about taking on and making those external skills or maybe strategies your own. King uses these ideas to explain how students learn from each other during peer tutoring, taking on each other's strategies and understandings.
But the source also brings up a critique of King's analysis, specifically around this idea of mutual appropriation being unique to same ability peers. What's the issue there?
Well, the critique points out that this idea of mutual appropriation, this back-and-forth process where both individuals learn from each other, isn't really unique to interactions between equals. Within Vygotsky's framework, this kind of reciprocal learning is generally seen as a normal part of all social interaction. Not just when someone is learning from an expert, but in any collaborative activity. It suggests that learning is always, to some extent, a two-way street.
That's an interesting point. Okay, so that's the individual plus view. Now, let's shift to the other end of the spectrum. The social-only view of distributed cognition. How is that different?
Right, the social-only perspective takes a really different approach. It argues that thinking, learning, and knowing aren't just shaped by the social world, they are fundamentally relationships between people and their social and cultural environment.
Wow. Okay, so thinking is the relationship.
Essentially, yes. Thinking, from this viewpoint, isn't located just in the head or just in the activity itself, but rather it's a social thing that just can't be broken down into individual psychological components. The focus moves from the individual learner to the collective activity and the social norms that guide it. Thinking about your workplace or any group you're part of, this social-only view suggests that the way you interact, the unspoken rules and norms, are actually fundamental to how knowledge is created and shared within that group. It's not just about individual contributions.
So it's a much more holistic view. The thinking is seen as emerging from the interaction itself rather than residing in the individuals who are interacting.
Exactly.
What kind of research questions are central to this social-only perspective?
The main research question here is about understanding the connection between social norms and group activity. How do the established ways of interacting, the cultural practices, the shared understandings within a group, how do they shape the thinking processes and the outcomes of that group's activities?
And which work from the source material really shows this social-only view in action.
Hewitt and Scardamalia's work on creating knowledge-building communities using CSIE, that's computer-supported intentional learning environment, is a good example of this perspective.
Okay, knowledge-building communities.
Yeah, their focus isn't on the individual learning of each student, but rather on how to design classroom activities and technologies to advance the collective knowledge of the entire classroom. They see the classroom as a potential self-improving system where the shared knowledge and ongoing contributions of all members drive progress.
Like a Wikipedia page.
That's a great analogy. Like a Wikipedia page that's constantly being updated and improved by many different contributors. The knowledge isn't just in one person's head. It emerges from the ongoing social activity.
That's a fascinating idea. The classroom itself is a thinking system. But the source also mentions that the research implications of this idea are still developing. What does that mean?
Well, while the idea of a classroom as a self-improving system is really interesting, the source points out that it's not immediately obvious how researchers should go about studying such a system.
Right.
It might require moving away from traditional methods that focus on individual students and developing new ways to analyze the overall behavior and emerging patterns of the classroom as a whole.
Right. It's a shift from studying the individual parts to studying the whole system. Now, the source also discusses Lebeau's work on medical diagnosis as potentially bridging these two views, the individual plus and the social only. How does his work connect to both?
Yeah, Lebeau's research looks at how medical students learn to use distributed cognitive tools,
Mm.
like taking patient histories and doing physical exams. He sees these tools not just as things that help individual thinking,
Uh-huh.
but as socially shared tools that are essential to the practices of the medical profession. His work touches on the individual plus view by focusing on how medical students appropriate these tools
Mm.
and the ways of using them, ultimately aiming to improve their individual diagnostic abilities.
So there's still a focus on individual learning and development, but it's deeply connected to a social and professional context.
Exactly. But it also hints at the social-only view by emphasizing the importance of understanding the practices and the shared knowledge within the medical community that these students are learning to participate in. It's about more than just an individual mastering a skill. It's about becoming part of a community of practice. The source also points out an interesting difference between Lebeau's work and King's. Lebeau emphasizes learning strategies that are specific to the content of medicine.
Right, like how to ask specific questions in a history.
Exactly. Whereas King focuses on more general learning strategies that could be applied across different subjects.
That's an important distinction. Lebeau seems to be saying that learning to do a medical interview isn't a generic skill you can learn in isolation. It's tied to the specific knowledge of medicine itself.
Precisely.
Now, the terms distributed cognition and situated cognition seem to come up quite a bit, sometimes even used in the same way, as the source points out with Hewitt and Scartamaglia's work. What's the relationship between these two ideas?
You're right, there's a lot of overlap,
Hmm.
and the terms are often used very similarly. The Force mentions a perspective that sees knowledge as distributed among people in their environment, which is called situative, but clearly lines up with many ways of understanding distributed cognition. Love, in her work, even outlines three types of situated approaches that kind of mirror the individual plus and social only views we've been talking about. Her cognition plus is very similar to individual plus, and her situated social practice closely resembles social only.
So in many ways, they're looking at the same core idea from slightly different angles.
It seems so.
But the source also mentions P's perspective, which tries to make a bit of a distinction, linking situated more to the physical world.
Yes, P argues that the situated approach often emphasizes how people can use features of the physical environment to help them think, reducing the need for mental effort, like using your fingers to count.
Okay.
He also suggests that situated cognition sometimes overlooks the important role of how tools are designed in shaping how we think and act in these situations, which he sees as a key contribution of the distributed cognition perspective.
But others would disagree.
Well, the authors of this overview point out that many who study situated cognition do explicitly include the social world as a crucial part of their framework. So the distinction isn't always that clear-cut.
It sounds like ultimately the most useful distinction might not be so much between distributed and situated as it is between these fundamental ways of thinking about cognition, either as primarily individual but influenced by the outside, or as inherently social and distributed across people and environments.
That's the conclusion the authors reach as well. They believe that this distinction between individual plus and social only will likely continue to be a central theme in research on distributed cognition, shaping the kinds of questions researchers ask, the methods they use, and ultimately the findings they discover.
Okay, so we've explored these different ways of thinking about it. Now let's look ahead. The source highlights some key issues for future research in distributed cognition. What are some of the challenges in how we study this kind of distributed thinking, methodologically, I mean?
Yeah, methodologically is a big one. One of the main challenges is that studying distributed cognition might require us to adopt or adapt research methods from other social sciences.
Like sociology, anthropology.
Exactly. If we're looking at thinking as something that's spread across people and their surroundings or as fundamentally social, then traditional psychological methods that focus just on the individual might not be enough. We might need to use approaches from fields like sociology, anthropology, or communication studies to really capture the complexities of these distributed systems.
That makes sense. If what we're studying is no longer just inside one person's head, then our ways of studying it need to change too.
Right.
The source also touches on the difference between division of cognitive labor and shared cognitive labor. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. This is a helpful way to understand how cognitive work gets done in distributed systems. Division of cognitive labor refers to situations where an individual essentially offloads a thinking task or responsibility onto a tool or another person,
Like using a calculator.
or asking someone else to remember a phone number. The focus here is still very much on the individual and how they are delegating cognitive work. On the other hand, shared cognitive labor involves individuals actively engaging together in an activity.
Okay.
It's a collaborative effort where each person's actions can influence the ongoing process.
Yeah.
Think about building furniture from IKEA instructions.
Uh-oh.
Initially, you might be just reading the instructions yourself and following them. That's more like division. You're offloading the memory of the steps to the paper.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you're building with a friend and one person holds the pieces while the other screws them together and you're both actively discussing the next step.
Is this piece B or C?
Exactly. That's more like shared cognitive labor.
Yeah.
You're thinking about how to assemble the furniture is happening together. King's peer tutoring model, for example, shows both. Students might offload some cognitive responsibility onto each other, or the instructions, division, but they also jointly work together to understand the material shared.
So it's not just about who's doing what, but also about how they're interacting and influencing each other's thinking.
Precisely.
And what about the challenge of studying this person environment as a single unit, as the social-only view suggests? That sounds tough.
It poses a real challenge for researchers, yeah. If you truly see the person and their environment as one inseparable unit when it comes to thinking, how do you actually study that?
Right.
Traditional research often tries to isolate different factors and see how they affect individuals. But if the individual and the environment are fundamentally linked in the thinking process, then separating them to study them becomes, well, problematic.
Mm.
Hewitt and Scartamoli's idea of studying the person plus their environment as one indivisible unit is a powerful concept, but the practical ways to do that in research are still being developed.
It sounds like it requires a fundamental shift in how we think about studying thinking itself.
It really does.
Another key issue the source brings up is whether we can apply ideas about individual thinking, things like memory, attention, etc., to groups. Can we just assume that groups remember or pay attention in the same way an individual does?
This is a point of a lot of discussion. Some researchers, like Salomon and Derry et al., believe that we can apply these ideas to groups, arguing that the same basic thinking processes happen at different levels.
So a group memory may be spread across people and files?
Kind of, yeah, that's the idea.
Mm.
A group might have a kind of memory that's spread across its members and its shared documents. However, others, like Nickerson, suggest that individual and distributed thinking are so different that we might need completely different terms and frameworks to understand them.
Okay.
Hutchins takes a bit of a middle ground, proposing that while the same basic thinking concepts might be relevant, they show up differently at the individual and group level.
Manifest differently.
Exactly. And then the social-only perspective largely rejects the idea of using traditional individual thinking concepts altogether, arguing that they don't really capture the social interaction that leads to shared understanding.
So there's a whole range of opinions on whether the tools we use to understand individual minds are useful for understanding how groups think together.
Definitely. No consensus there yet.
Finally, the source emphasizes some areas that haven't been studied enough, particularly around individual differences within groups and the impact of social dynamics like power. Why are these important to consider?
Well, the authors argue that we need to pay closer attention to how individual differences among group members, things like how people communicate, their backgrounds, their status within the group, can affect the thinking processes and the outcomes of group activities.
Right.
For example, research on how men and women might tend to ask questions or respond to challenges differently. That could certainly play a role in how students interact in a peer tutoring setting, or how a team works together in a meeting.
That's a really interesting point. We often talk about teamwork, but we might not always think about these more subtle but potentially significant differences in how people communicate and interact.
Exactly. And the example given in the source about the surgeon and the resident. It shows how power dynamics and differences in status can influence communication and the flow of information within a distributed thinking system.
The resident being indirect.
Right. The resident's indirect questioning, rather than a direct warning, is a clear example of how unevenly distributed knowledge and power can affect problem solving. The authors rightly point out that focusing on actual communication styles might be more insightful than just looking at broad categories like gender.
And the source also mentions that many studies of distributed cognition don't really consider the broader social and political context in which these interactions are happening. Why is that an oversight?
The authors argue that thinking activity, even in seemingly contained situations like a doctor-patient visit or a team meeting, always takes place within a larger social and political environment.
Like funding pressures or...
Yeah, things like the need to get funding, the desire to include different viewpoints, or even just the existing power structures within a group can significantly influence how knowledge is shared, how decisions are made, and ultimately how the group functions cognitively. The challenge, as they point out, is figuring out just how much of that wider context we need to consider to truly understand how a group behaves. It's a boundary problem, really.
It sounds like getting a more complete picture of distributed cognition requires us to look beyond just the immediate interaction and consider these broader social and political forces at play.
I think that's fair to say.
So, to wrap things up, what's the key message from this deep dive into distributed cognition for you, our listener?
I think the main takeaway is that distributed cognition provides a really valuable way to understand how we think and learn. But it's not a single simple idea.
Right.
There are different ways to understand it, from seeing our environment and tools as influencing our individual minds, that individual plus, to seeing thinking itself as something that is fundamentally social and happens across people and their surroundings, the social-only view.
And these sources really highlight that there's an ongoing discussion and a lot of important questions that researchers are still exploring.
Definitely.
Like how to best study these distributed thinking systems and what the implications are for how we teach and how we collaborate.
Absolutely. This is a field that's still developing, and these different perspectives are what's driving the research forward. It's exciting, really.
So for you listening, maybe think about a time you learned something new in a group or used a tool to solve a problem. Did it feel like the thinking was just happening in your head, or was it truly distributed among the people and things around you? How does understanding this idea of distributed cognition change how you see those experiences? We encourage you to think about these different viewpoints and how they might apply to your own experiences and areas of interest. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.